Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our final public lecture of the fall semester at Roger Williams University School of Architecture, Art, and Historic Preservation. I'm Nathan Fash, Associate Professor of Architecture and co-chair of the Events Committee, along with Andrew Cohen. And tonight actually marks the end of my 4 years as co-chair of exhibitions and lectures here at our school. So I'd like to take the liberty here to say just a quick but very heartfelt thanks to everyone who's participated over these years and helped to make this a success. So that thanks really goes to our students for whom we have great aspirations and who we have enjoyed as audience members and even exhibition designers. It also goes to my colleagues and co-chair and co-director who have been instrumental in inviting speakers, crafting and installing exhibitions, hosting guest speakers, participating in the events either before or during or after in so many ways. And this is just a thanks to everyone for inspiring me to continue to bring great voices and content to our stage. It's been a pleasure. And on that note, it feels particularly wonderful for me to be able to segue to the introduction of our faculty spotlight speaker tonight, our very own Professor Gail Fenske. And in a moment, I'll pass the mic to Professor Randall Van Scapen, who will introduce her. But before I do, I want to mention that the Faculty Spotlight is a relatively new addition to the event series in which we get to hear and learn in more depth about the exciting and great work that our faculty is doing outside of their teaching. We've heard from Jeanette Wessel, Ann Proctor, and Elaine Stiles, who has been instrumental in spearheading the effort to make the Faculty Spotlight a reality. And I must say that with each of these lectures, I have felt more proud to be part of this faculty, and I'm sure that Gail's talk tonight will fit right in that regard. And with that, I'll hand over the audio waves to Randall.
Thank you, Professor Fash. Thanks for your leadership on this and also for the opportunity to introduce one of our great colleagues. One of the fascinating things about this Faculty Spotlight lecture is that even though you think you know people who are down the hall from you or who you are taking classes from as a student or whatever, you find out new things that you didn't know, both about their scholarly work, but also about them personally. So it's a great opportunity to get to know Professor Fenske a little bit better. So one of the things that students oftentimes don't know about professors is where they went to school when they were students. And so Professor Fenske's academic life, when she was forming herself as a historian, she studied at two primary institutions, Arizona State University and MIT. She received her bachelor's of architecture at Arizona State, which included courses in art and architectural history. And then she went on to graduate school at MIT, where she received her master's, her PhD in history, theory, and criticism of architecture, which of course is her specialty. And she did that right up the road there in Boston. And she's also a licensed architect in the state of Massachusetts. So, she's familiar to us and her students through her classes that she teaches at Roger Williams, including the survey, Art and Architectural History 1, History of Art and Architecture 1, as we call it, as well as very important courses for architects in training, History of Modern Architecture, History of American Architecture, Urbanism and Landscape, as well as some grad courses on the theoretical origins of modernism and the skyscraper. So, she's really woven into, students' curriculum as they're making their way through as architecture students, and also history of art and architecture, as well as a specialization or second major. One thing, that recent students and even recent faculty might not know is that Professor Fenske taught studio. She did so for many years. And so, we think of her, as the historian component of our school, but she's taught studio in the 90s and early 2000s, Core Studio 1 and 2. She's also taught elsewhere. at Wellesley, MIT, and Cornell. So she's had experiences with other institutions that she brings to us, and that's really great. But what we're going to hear today is really her scholarship. And we're going to hear, this area that she knows so well, the early 20th century America, New York in particular. And of course, she's published widely in this particular chronological period and subject. Her two major books being The Skyscraper in the City from 2008, University of Chicago Press, and then co-edited a volume on Alto in America with Stanford Anderson and David Fixler that came out in 2012 by Yale University Press. And of course, many articles, essays beyond that, chapters in books and so on. Currently, she is the book review editor on the editorial team of the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians. She was recently the chair of our very own History of Art and Architecture program, leading that for the past few years before I started doing that last year. So in terms of our curriculum, in terms of scholarship, Gail plays a really large role in our school, and we're so happy to celebrate her role together this evening. So please join me in welcoming her for our December faculty spotlight lecture, and her lecture titled New York in the 20s, Art, Architecture, and the City.
Randall, thank you for that generous introduction. And I'd also like to thank Elaine Stiles and Nate Fash and the organizers of the school's Faculty Spotlight series for the invitation to speak. I'd also like to thank the university's Foundation to Promote Scholarship and Teaching for their support of this research, and thank you all for attending. This talk is a work in progress. It is drawn from the introduction to my book, Skyscrapers, and the section of the introduction is called New Perceptual Experiences. I'm writing the book for the Library of Congress, and it's to highlight their collections on skyscrapers. It's also a revised version of an earlier talk that I gave last May for Wadsworth Atheneum and Museum of Art as part of their exhibition on the sculptor Paul Manship. Like I said, a work in progress, but something I've enjoyed working on. Rockefeller Center, its planning, architecture, and art, including the sculptor Paul Manship's Prometheus, concluded an energetic decade of construction during the 1920s, when New York reached its apogee as the world's modern metropolis. Throughout the decade, architects, artists, and enlightened builders and patrons of the arts collaborated in the creation of a city at once modern, at times challenging in its contradictions, but always visually provocative in works that celebrated the public experience of the city. How did it all come about? The skyscrapers of the city's midtown in the vicinity of Rockefeller Center invested the city with an unmistakable architectural identity, with towers sporting ornate crests, later called Art Deco, most visibly here, the GE building to the left, the twin towers of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, and in the distance, the Chrysler building. In the nearer view, Grand Central Station's office tower with chateau-inspired roof. By the late 1920s, Midtown was widely known as the city's most energetic site of construction, and from the standpoint of public entertainment and the arts, its newest center of gravity. This is not to say that construction came to a halt downtown. Wall Street now eclipsed London as the world's center of banking and finance, and throughout the 1920s, rival financial enterprises, here you're seeing One Wall Street and the city's service company, engaged in an energetic competition for height, creating the remarkable setback and pinnacled silhouette for which the city is also known. Behind the creation of these skylines and the 1920s modern metropolis more generally, there existed a clear set of rules, defined with great precision in the zoning resolution of 1916. This new law comprised two major components, use districts and height districts. The height districts, most important to the shaping and indeed the architectural quality and aesthetic character of the commercial city, the framers of the resolution governed with exacting dimensions. These prescribed setbacks and an angle of light, with the twin aims of controlling the egregious type of speculative investment skyscraper and making the city's streets habitable, as well as dignified experientially for the city's sidewalk crowds. Behind the mathematics lay countless massing studies, focused particularly on the nuances of proportion under the guidance of the Beaux-Arts trained architect George Burdett Ford. He envisioned through these studies no less than the future shape of the 1920s metropolis. In conceiving the future city, Beaux-Arts architects assumed a guiding hand. Even before the design of the city's first setback skyscraper, Harvey Wiley Corbett and Hugh Ferris collaborated to produce a visually compelling series of studies showing their colleagues in the profession and others just what this future city might look like when shaped by the criteria of the new law, delineating the masses of construction as if sculpting in clay. First, they illustrated the law's angle of light. Second, how the architect might bring in light to the habitable spaces within. Third, how those spaces might be dimensioned for the uses of offices or apartments. And fourth, how those dimensions would be constructed when framed in steel. In the face of controversy over the seemingly cold and mathematical architectural implications suggested by the law, these architects advocated their own drawings as a source of inspiration. Ralph Walker's Barclay Vesey building for the New York Telephone Company, the first architectural project to illustrate the implications of the new law, was located on a site adjacent to the Hudson River, not far from the financial district downtown. Walker was asked to design a utilitarian building housing several floors of telephone equipment for the telephone company, not a monument, but still, he gave the company an identity as well as dignity with graceful but bold cubic setback proportions modulated by rhythmic abstracted piers and graced with a new type of ornamental repertory that highlighted appropriately enough advances in communication from ancient Babylon to the age of radio. The ornament of the grand east-west lobby featured a new decorative aesthetic, a beguiling, nature-inspired ornamental scheme with flattened and abstracted intertwining vines and trees in low relief, later called Art Deco. Closer to Midtown, the architect Raymond Hood took his cues from the new law when designing the American Radiator building, here showing a design that stepped back as it rose to the sky, seemingly to literally grow out of Manhattan soil and bedrock, here much closer to the surface, becoming lighter and more ethereal as the tower's setbacks dissolved into the sky, suggesting in its pattern of ornamentation the glow of a torch in the night, thus evoking for the spectator the fire and warmth of the heating systems so critical to the very life of the skyscraper. But Hood's design had another equally important source, the Finnish architect Elio Saarinen's widely acclaimed second-place design for the Chicago Tribune Tower competition of 1922. Hood had won the competition with a Gothic tower that featured soaring verticals inspired by New York's Woolworth Building, along with the Butter Tower of the Cathedral of Rouen. In the eyes of the architectural profession, however, it was not Hood's, but Saarinen's design that should have won. Hood's American Radiator building, nonetheless, caught the eye of the artist Georgia O'Keeffe. O'Keeffe admired the modernity and power of skyscrapers. In her mind, the new monuments of this new world, which rivaled those of the old. O'Keeffe depicted the Radiator building abstractly, but also in a subtle, lyrical way. She made the skyscraper one of her key themes as a painter, drawn to the sense of limitlessness and aspiration it seemed to signify. Skyscrapers were at once tellingly American and distinctly modern, for O'Keeffe offering an answer to the question, what will the 20th century look like? O'Keeffe was part of the circle around Alfred Stieglitz's 291 Gallery, which through its exhibitions promoted New York over Paris as the battleground of modern civilization, that is, as the newest center of the avant-garde. In doing so, they pointed to the skyscraper as the first artifact of American culture to attract sustained international attention, giving the city unexpectedly a new world identity. O'Keeffe watched the construction of the city's skyscraper from the window of her apartment high in the 30th story of the Shelton Hotel. From this perspective, close to the top of the 33-story building, she experienced a sense of freedom, important to the modern artist, but especially if that artist happened to be a woman. New York and its skyscrapers embodied for O'Keeffe the very experience of emancipation. O'Keeffe reasoned that the modern artist in New York must live at the various highest elevations in the heart of the roaring city, so that he, as she put it, had a place to behold the city before his eyes. She may well have been referring to Stieglitz, to whom she married in 1924 and with whom she shared her apartment high in the Shelton Hotel. O'Keeffe was also deeply impressed by the skyscraper's towering and at times disorienting, destabilizing heights. Her Shelton with sunspots illustrates the power of the skyscraper's sheer verticality, but also revealingly, in her view, shows as well the vulnerability of such a man-made structure in the face of nature. Nature's power, O'Keeffe evokes with the drama of the sun, which not only steals our attention away from the skyscraper itself, but also literally, as she put it, took a bite out of its side. And in so doing, sprinkled sunspots, that is, the spots the modern photographer sees when pointing a lens straight to the sun. The views from the Shelton were no less than exhilarating. O'Keeffe's East River from the Shelton looked directly towards the west and the late afternoon sun. The city's industry is vividly silhouetted in the foreground, but its skyscrapers are curiously absent. O'Keeffe would soon enough shift her interest as a painter to the desert landscapes of the Southwest. Stieglitz, by contrast, rekindled his interest in the skyscraper, here capturing Rockefeller Center and the RCA building at the so-called magic hour, when the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky. He referred to New York as, quote, madder than ever, but appreciated his retreat high in the Shelton Hotel, something like mid-ocean, an experience heightened by the winds howling and, he said, terrible shaking of the hulk of steel in which we live, then adding that it's a wonderful place. Not unlike O'Keeffe and Stieglitz, Hugh Ferris found similarly high locations from which to survey the city and to sketch his vision for its future. Ferris's Metropolis of Tomorrow showed that future city, constructed in accordance with the new zoning law, but also infused throughout its design with what he described as humanistic values in city planning, order, and harmony. What many viewed as the unpoetic reality of the law, Ferris continued to consider an opportunity. He identified in the setback skyscrapers it described the basis for this imaginary future metropolis, with buildings that rose like mountains out of the vast urban infrastructure of transportation and machinery below, stepping back to become more ethereal as they met the sky. Ferris's pyramidal clusters of towers, each of which took 4 city blocks and rose 1,000 feet high, he nonetheless organized along the axes and cross-axes of wide avenues, planted squares, and lower perimeter blocks of apartments, which spoke to the importance of the city's public spaces, along with their associated greenery, light, and air. One of the important virtues of Ferris's future metropolis is that it illustrated the potentials of the new zoning law's prescribed setbacks in creating terraces for living aloft. Immediately, he recognized their possibilities as elevated public spaces, offering light, gardens, and views, inspired in part by the day's popular imagery of ancient Babylonian hanging gardens, for instance, D.W. Griffith's Intolerance, the film of 1916. He asked how might they be put to public use, perhaps with a masked wall on top of some fine arts building. During the mid-1920s, construction in Midtown reached newly dazzling and competitive heights during a spurt of activity on sites surrounding Grand Central Station. The Channon Building, commissioned by the builder, Irwin Channon, a theatrical producer and founder of the Channon Construction Company in 1919, and designed by the architects Sloan and Robertson, took Saarinen Chicago Tribune Tower competition entry as a point of departure, and at 56 stories and 680 feet high, set a new record for the Midtown. The Channon's base served as a transportation node with a direct link to the Grand Central Terminal and to the city's IRT subway lines. Given its site at the intersection of 3 different height districts, 3 different sets of rules controlled its setback design, and the design took the shape of a base with an intricate sequence of setbacks from which rose a tall, thin rectangular slab. The Channon is especially noted for its program of ornamentation. In the building's lower stories, above which extend buttresses that are in turn echoed in the crown, a flattened tile cladding by the artist René Chambelin shows highly stylized floral motifs incised in terracotta, taking their inspiration from Paris's 1925 Exposition of Decorative Arts. Paris's 1925 exposition is viewed still today as the primary source for the wide array of artistic, crafted, and ornamental forms that in the early 1960s received the descriptive term Art Deco. When one considers the structures of this exposition and their ornamental patterns, all of which came from widely diverse places in the world, all times in history, among them African, pre-Columbian, and American indigenous cultures, along with those of European, Cubism, Germanist, Expressionism, and the Vienna Secession, this makes sense, as designers had discovered what was considered at the time a wholly new, exciting, and exotic formal repertoire. But the sources for the imaginations of architects, decorative artists, and craftsmen extended still more broadly across the entire world of visuality we associate with the 1920s, from film to the popular graphic arts. Here, the set designers for Robert Vina's 1920 horror films, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Genuine, took their inspiration from the expressionist circle around the architect Bruno Taut, infusing their sets with the emotive, even irrational qualities of tilting planes and angular lines. But the influence of innovative filmmaking and set designs, however, cut both ways. The Austrian filmmaker Fritz Lang, just as inspired by the city as O'Keeffe, having traveled to New York for the first time in 1924, where he photographed Broadway at night, and just as oriented towards discerning the city's future as Ferris, invented an equally compelling celluloid vision for that future, along with three architect set designers, Eric Kettelhood, Otto Hunte, and Karl Volbricht. It showed an entire city quarters rising like mountain ranges, at the very pinnacle of which the Tower of Babel, a so-called temple of work, replaced the tower of the church. Lang's narrative centered on the character Freder, his love for the working girl Maria, and the conflict with his father, Joe Fredersen, the almighty ruler of the huge metropolis, who oversaw armies of workers laboring underground like slaves at gigantic machines. Lang aimed to illustrate all at once the age's political conflicts, along with the hopes, fears, and the current European fashion, however sinister, along with American ways. But too often overlooked are the artistic sources closer to home. The artists at work in their studios in New York City. The Ukrainian-American printmaker and socialist, Louis Lozowick's New York, emphasizes in his words the industrialization and standardization that find their outward sign in the rigid geometries of the city. Here, an evocation of the Brooklyn Bridge, curving elevated tracks, and step-back skyscrapers packed with illuminated windows are set against a dark night sky. The German-American graphic artist and architect, Weinhold Reiss, commissioned by the Survey Graphic, focused on portraying the energy and excitement taking place in Harlem, the city's uptown. His Harlem at night is infused with the same energy, albeit with a freer, more improvised vitality in the play of architect geometries we see in Lozowick's New York. Throughout the 1920s, Harlem thrived as a national center for the arts, music, especially jazz, theater, literature, and poetry, along with the visual arts, functioned as a crucible for the distinctive African-American culture known still today as the Harlem Renaissance. The musician, actor, and political activist Paul Robeson wrote that the best way for African Americans to overcome racism was for their artists to succeed in a white-dominated culture, and they had clearly done so by the mid-1920s, with musical performances on Broadway coupled with the energetic nightlife of Harlem in a golden age that set the stage for the 1960s civil rights movement. The Chrysler Building is bound up with this filmic, theatrical, and artistic imagery, and for this reason is still today the classic Art Deco skyscraper in New York. By contrast to the Channon Building, its massing is not a slab, but rather that of a tall, thin tower, rising out of a broad base and gracefully ascending series of setbacks. When completed, it took the title of tallest in the world at 1,048 feet, surpassing the height of the Woolworth Building, the earlier record holder. The project started out as a speculative office building commissioned from the Beaux-Arts architect William Van Allen by the New York State Senator and builder of Coney Island's dreamland, William Reynolds. Reynolds now dreamed of building the world's tallest skyscraper. Van Allen produced his first design for Reynolds, but then at the spur of the moment, Reynolds sold the site and the design, indeed the entire project, to Walter Chrysler, chair of the Chrysler Automobile Corporation. Van Allen continued to revise the design under Chrysler's direction, focusing on the tower's pinnacle, which started out as a great jeweled sphere, then ended up as a fantastic terraced dome with 7 concentric segments mounting one above another and pierced with triangular windows to suggest the spokes of a wheel, all fabricated in the new stainless chrome nickel steel. Chrysler had insisted on that, from which projected the legendary spire. The result was a fantastic iconography that related the skyscraper to the Chrysler Corporation and to the automobile. The theatricality of Van Allen's design fit in with the theatricality of the city, not only as shown by the nightlife of Harlem and film, but also in the great popular theatrical spectacles of Broadway, and even the so-called cinematic novels of F. Scott Fitzgerald. This was especially evident in the views of the Chrysler within its equally theatrical settings, here flanked by the towers of the RCA Victor, and then it became the GE building, and the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. The smallest details of this building are extraordinarily important, and many are direct references to Chrysler's principal product. In the frieze at the 30th story, a lone line of shiny Chrysler hubcaps speeds towards the corners where winged hood ornaments and higher still eagle heads in stainless steel take the place of Gothic gargoyles. Striations of black brick dematerialize the tower's corners with horizontals, and zigzag chevrons allude to radio waves. The themes continue at the building's base, taking the form of an Egyptian entrance portal framed in black marble and stainless steel, and in the precision machine freely rendered jazzy detailing that leads the sidewalk spectator inside. The critic, Douglas Haskell, accused Van Allen of stunts and effects, and Lewis Mumford of inane romanticism. But in fact, the 1920s was an age of great theatrical spectacles, and for both Van Allen and Chrysler, architecture too might entice the urban spectator with yet another form of theater. The theater continued inside. The Chrysler's triangular lobby, a far cry from a conventional classical lobby, featured an astounding quality of craftsmanship and materials, starting with Moroccan red marble walls and yellow sienna marble floors. A marble stair linked the lobby directly to the IRT subway lines, and a concourse led directly on axis to Grand Central Terminal. Looking upwards, the visitor finds an image of the skyscraper etched in the ceiling plane, and in making their way to 4 banks of 32 high-speed elevators, the finest abstracted floral patterning and precision metalwork, and a spectrum of exotic woods. After taking an elevator to the 66th floor, the visitor might ascend by stair to the Cloud Club, a varied suite of rooms, or still more exciting, to the tower's observation gallery, where it was reported that Van Allen outdid himself. Inspired by the German expressionist films, he treated the walls as a series of angular inward tilting planes, and above the dado, painted fading sun rays and a star-studded nighttime sky featured light fixtures as miniature Saturns. Walter Chrysler's original toolbox is exhibited within the glass vitrine to the left. He had started out as a machinist working on the shop floor. When looking at the tools and then out to the city, the viewer cannot escape a sense of spiritual transcendence about this man and his career. That New York skyscrapers engaged in a popular form of urban theatrics designed to engage an audience of sidewalk crowds became especially clear in the late 1920s, when the already highly publicized competitive race for height reached a fever pitch. This, the city's reporters thoroughly exploited in covering the rivalry of construction between H. Craig Severance and his partner Yasuo Matsui's Bank of Manhattan Company. Matsui's drawing for the project is on the left. He's a Japanese-American architect, and you see in that the influence of Japan. The competition was between the Bank of Manhattan Company and the Chrysler Building. Severance and Van Allen were former partners in architectural practice. They split acrimoniously, and later each announced that he would be building the tallest skyscraper in the world. The race for height was transformed via publicity into an extension of that earlier and now bitter personal rivalry. As Van Allen was finalizing the details for the crown of the Chrysler Building, he reportedly heard that Severance had obtained a permit to add a lantern atop the 60 stories and 10 penthouses of his design. And for good measure, Severance was planning to add a 50-foot flagpole as well. But Van Allen, according to reporters, was not to be outdone. He designed a 185-foot stainless steel spire, which he hid within the crown's so-called fire shaft, and kept secret until Severance topped off his design at 71 stories and 927 feet. Then, in a blaze of publicity, Van Allen watched as workers hoisted the spire into place. The signal was given, he recalled, and the spire gradually emerged from the top of the dome like a butterfly from its cocoon. In about 90 minutes, it was securely riveted into position, the highest piece of stationary steel in the world at 1,046 feet high. Severance, it was said, was aesthetically vanquished as well. This was W. Parker Chase writing in his book, New York, the Wonder City in 1932. Van Allen celebrated by dressing up like his building at the city's next Beaux-Arts ball, and his contemporaries called him the Ziegfeld of his profession. Severance's command of the lower Manhattan skyline with his Bank of Manhattan Company, however, was short-lived. 2 years later, Clinton and Russell topped off the city's service building just after the construction of two additional rival towers, Citibank and Farmers Trust and One Wall Street, both completed in 1931. In addition to these four tallest spires, scores of major skyscrapers were built in the financial district south of Maiden Lane. Together, they completely transformed the lower Manhattan skyline, bringing attention to New York as a world center of finance, but also investing it with a new outcropping of pinnacles, each sporting a unique and memorable crest, an unforgettable city of towers. This uniqueness of this particular newly built creation, this city of towers, was not lost on artists, and especially the photographer Berenice Abbott. Having just returned from the city of Paris in 1927, Abbott was enthralled by the new heights of lower Manhattan and determined to document with straight photography the reality of the novel spatial experiences it afforded. In her words, the city's hurrying tempo, its congested streets, the past jostling the present, and those fleeting collisions that define contemporaneity, that is, the pulse of the times, the vanishing instant, the ever-changing, constant now. Those are her words, and now is capitalized and underlined. What she called the unnatural canyon of Broadway showed people reduced to the scale of ants. Her views from the top of One Wall Street, looking down at the city's service building, and then again from the city's service observation deck, its curved aluminum railings foregrounded against the distant cubistic jumble of structures, captured the full array of new perceptual experiences, at once claustrophobic, giddy, fragmentary, and vertiginous, identified with the skyscraper, which she never presented. She never presented the skyscraper as an isolated object, but instead as part of a perpetually changing and always inevitably disruptive relationship with its urban surroundings. At the same time, skyscrapers continued to raise the ceiling of the Midtown, the newest addition to the skyline being Raymond Hood's Daily News building, completed in 1930. Hood had developed a new idea for the massing of the tall building, persuading his newspaper client to erect less office space on the lower floors than the zoning code would allow, so that he might create a more dramatic architectural silhouette, not a tower, but almost a slab. Ever since his Gothic design for the Chicago Tribune Tower, Hood had continued to experiment with the language of verticals for skyscraper exteriors. Here, still further flattening and abstracting the verticals, creating a stark, striped graphic effect, utilizing for those verticals a cream-colored glazed brick set off against russet-colored spandrels. So far, the simplest yet most radical of treatments for a skyscraper's elevations. This new type of curtain wall, like a slipcover, sheathed the steel frame office interiors, which Hood designed for good lighting throughout to a uniform depth of 27 feet. The slab dropped off in steps as it ascended in height, and also as the elevator core also stepped back, given that fewer elevators were required to reach the highest floors. The design consequently took on a new type of modern character. Hood was in dialogue with European architectural avant-garde, and this would protect his design for the RCA building at Rockefeller Center. Still, Hood had not forgotten the capacity for a certain type of urban theater. For this, he exploited the newspaper's long-standing association with the world, given that as a mass medium, its role was to have eyes constantly on the world. At the lobby's center, he placed a huge revolving globe, half sunk into a recess in the floor, dramatically lit from below. He sheathed the lobby's walls with black glass, sloped them inward toward a faceted dome ceiling. Haskell pointed to the lobby's advertising art, others to its theatrical stunts and effects. But Midtown's most important and most grandly scaled project by far was Rockefeller Center, and Raymond Hood would assume a primary role in its design. Rockefeller Center's site was vast in scale, covering several city blocks along Fifth Avenue between 48th and 51st Streets. It was an enlightened project from the start, showing a concern for the city's public life and public domain. Its builders asked, can a group of skyscrapers be arranged in such a way to give something back to the city? The project had a complex development history. It was initially conceived as a home for the Metropolitan Opera Company, which aspired to construct a cultural center with a new opera house facing a spacious plaza to be designed by Benjamin Wistar Morris, surrounded by revenue-generating office buildings. But they struggled with how to offset the high cost of building the opera house, even while utilizing office rentals to ensure suitable profits. In December 1928, a new protagonist, John D. Rockefeller, entered the project scene. With Rockefeller's support, the opera formed the Metropolitan Square Corporation. Rockefeller brought in the Todd Robertson and Todd Engineering Corporation to study the project's speculative financing and appointed the Associated Architects, a team that included Raymond Hood, along with Harvey Wiley Corbett, both of whom were noted for their skyscrapers. But within 1 year, the stock market crashed, and in December 1929, the Metropolitan Opera abandoned the project. By January 1930, Rockefeller's Associated Architects had proposed Scheme G3, with the aim of optimizing the use of the land. The plaza in front of the opera they now conceived as an agora or forum, which they surrounded with 4 major skyscrapers. The drawings illustrating Scheme G3 show the center's most important organizational concept, the wide spacing of towers combined with terraced roof gardens, all arranged around axes and cross-axes, following Beaux-Arts principles of design and showing a generosity of public space. As the design advanced, the architects, and especially Hood, continued to refine the terraces as elevated public gardens, with sculpture, outdoor theaters, greenhouses, and an elaborate system of stairs and mid-air bridges. Journalists described the project as a new Babylon, an updated hanging gardens that was sure to appeal to the collective imagination as a civic attraction. Rockefeller attracted European investors to the project. The Maison Francaise and the British Empire buildings would frame the center's main axis, setting up the promenade to the RCA building as architectural and economic studies proceeded side by side. The RCA building, a dominant vertical marker designed by Raymond Hood as a tall, exceedingly thin slab, replaced the Metropolitan Opera as the focal point for the project. The radio had become an increasingly popular medium throughout the 1920s, and now RCA oversaw nearly 400 stations throughout the country. At the RCA building's base, the architects refined the forum as the culminating experience of the axial promenade, with the focal point for the entire project. Its placement right at the base of the building suggested a powerful sense of release of space to the public domain. The quality of the forum, now called a plaza, was important. It was to be a true focal point for the city's public life. And in doing so, Paul Manship's Prometheus served as a superb visual magnet and attraction. It was expected that visitors, their eyes on Prometheus, would proceed down the center's axial promenade from Fifth Avenue towards the climatic verticality of the RCA building, until they arrived to overlook the fountain and diners in the summer, skaters in the winter, all set against the United Nations parade of flags surrounding its rim. The axial promenade and plaza on the ground, the gardens on the roofs, and the widely separated towers together proclaimed the spatial luxury of Rockefeller Center. But the hanging gardens of Babylon archetype was realized only in partial form. The bridges were costly and entailed extensive public design review. And without them, it was difficult to realize the gardens as truly public gardens. But still, fragments of the original vision remain. And as the project nonetheless set a new standard for American urban design. Hood's design for the 70-story, 850-foot high RCA building, daringly thin with sawn limestone verticals, not unlike those he had designed for the Daily News building, perfected his idea of the skyscraper as a slab. Rising like a sheer cliff, it gracefully eroded in setbacks, with a powerful sense of verticality, but an equally powerful sense of mass and weight. Seated on the observation deck, high on the narrow roof of the slab, and designed to recall the deck of an ocean liner, spectators could feel the narrowness of the slab's dimensions, as well as their distance from the city, and thus participate in a modern way of moving through the world. The center's finest interior spaces are the Radio City Music Hall and its associated foyer, which replaced the Metropolitan Opera House with a new type of theater, that of mass entertainment and spectacle. The RKO Corporation, now a part of the RCA Corporation, lured the theater impresario Samuel Lionel Rothafel, or Roxy, to manage the music hall. Roxy conceived and oversaw a theater that dwarfed the day's movie palaces, featuring performances that combined film with live musical numbers. Huge descending arches patterned after the sun's rays cascaded towards the music hall's great stage. Roxy was seeking to achieve a unity between the audience and the performers within this single vast space. The foyer, a lofty room with a magnificent sweeping stair that curved up to balcony overlooks, featured gold leaf ceilings, chandeliers hanging like confections of frosted glass, and a garden mural comprising stylized floral shapes, all added to the decorous yet frivolous effect. For architectural critics, noted among them the modern historian Siegfried Gideon, Rockefeller Center represented a tour de force and a standing reminder that the structure of the city, the modern city, must be and could be transformed, not only for the sake of the individual, but for the sake of the community as a whole. Still, in New York, the competitive quest for height continued, most recently with the Noyes Schultz Company proposing a 150-story super skyscraper to rise 1,600 feet high on a 2-block site at Broadway and Duane Street. The Empire State, though, culminated the competition, surpassing the Chrysler to reach a height of 1,250 feet, which included the 200-foot mooring mast, representing the most dramatic design as of yet for the skyscraper as an isolated tower. Extraordinary in its siting, standing wholly free in its surroundings at 5th Avenue and 34th Street, far from the earlier cluster of skyscrapers grouped around Grand Central Station. From the start of the project, initially under the direction of Floyd Brown, speculative real estate economics governed all aspects of the design. Brown contracted to buy and demolish the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, to put up a mixed-use 50-story building. But he defaulted on his mortgage, and John J. Raskob, joined by the former governor of New York, Alfred E. Smith, stepped in to take it over. Raskob and Smith transformed the design into a major office tower, exploring along the way a number of well-known financial formulas for towers at 55 stories or 80 stories in height, following the by now long-tested financial formulas governing real estate finance, which for this site stipulated an economical height of 63 to at most 75 stories. In the end, however, Raskob and Smith decided on 80 stories, 1,050 feet, knowing full well that the top 5 stories would be less than profitable, but also thoroughly understanding the advertising advantages of great height, and especially of surpassing the Chrysler in height, arguing that such a benefit, the highest in the world, would make the uneconomical height worth the cost. The Empire State's construction, and in particular the speed of that construction, made the project spectacular. The entire project, from the architect's first sketches to the date of its completion, took a mere 20 months, with the steel frame averaging a story per day. With the stock market crash of October 1929, the proverbial phrase, "time is money," took on a new and special importance. Sterrett Brothers and Aiken, the project's builder, employed the most advanced steel fabrication and erection techniques of the day, following the model of a Ford factory assembly line. High-strength steel, a total of 58,000 tons, engineered in standardized dimensions to reduce the total number of framing members, especially the columns, along with pre-cut standardized limestone panels, chrome nickel steel mullions, and cast aluminum spandrels and glass were all prefabricated in advance and systematically delivered to the site according to a precise schedule. When the materials arrived on site, transported by 500 trucks a day, the project superintendents transferred them to elevators from which they circulated via railways, each floor, to the 3,000 workers at designated locations on those floors. To further increase speed, Sterrett Brothers and Aiken installed derricks on numerous setbacks to rapidly hoist the steel. Workers riveted in place 51,900 tons of structural steel within 6 months during 1930. The project amounted to what Sterrett Brothers and Aiken called no less than a vast scheduling job. The skyscraper's ceremonial topping off at the 86th story with the hoisting of an American flag celebrated the structural ironworkers' all-important contribution to the project, especially during the depths of the Depression, when they stood in line around the block waiting for the opportunity to get to work. The photographer, Louis Hine, viewed all of the workers who built the Empire State as modern heroes, prominently featuring them in his Men at Work, which contained over 1,000 images, published in 1932. Hine's process of photography entailed climbing the structure itself, stage by stage, balancing his cumbersome equipment, swinging out in a basket at the 80th floor for views from the top, documenting the craftsmanship and the industrial skills of the workers, who he considered artists. These were men who it was a privilege to know, who had imprinted on the city its very character, which they had in fact built themselves in coordinating their actions with their skills and their tools. They had yet and still have yet to receive their due. The completion of the Empire State compelled the film director, Marion C. Cooper, to tell the story of the great ape Kong, captured against his will on Skull Island. He was there on a mountaintop and brought to Manhattan Island, enslaved for show, but breaking free to climb to the top of the city's highest man-made mountain, clutching Fay Ray. And in the film's culminating scene, pilots with their modern flying machines engaged in a final fatal aerial attack. Just as compelling were the repeated attempts to dock a dirigible at the Empire State's mooring mast. It did happen just once for a mail delivery, which took 3 minutes in winds of 40 miles per hour. Later, the 800-foot-long German dirigible, the Hindenburg, flew by on its way to dock in Lakehurst, New Jersey. All these are, these are only a few of the stories and scenes associated with the Empire State, which still holds a powerful grip on the imagination. Collectively, the skyscrapers as designed, constructed, and interpreted and understood by artists, filmmakers, and photographers had invested New York City with a profound sense of place. This the architect Frank Lloyd Wright fully understood, even while he critiqued the skyscraper in his Disappearing City of 1932. And Wright was one of the most vociferous critics of the skyscraper. He asked, pointing to the view of Lower Manhattan, "Find the citizen." He proposed an alternative in his Broadacre City, a completely decentralized anti-city, and reaction to what he viewed the evil ways of the city with its tyrannies of the skyscraper and centralized capitalism. Broadacre City would return those citizens to a purer, more natural state. Still, it is telling that Wright unveiled his plans for Broadacre City at Rockefeller Center in 1935, and that less than a decade later, he returned to the city, once again, given its profound sense of place, as the best of locations for his own temple to the arts, the Guggenheim Museum. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gail. And to the audience, everybody is welcome to join our question answer session now. So use either the chat or the Q&A, and I'll pick up questions and read them back so that she can have a chance to answer. So while everybody warms up a little bit, maybe I'll ask one. Thank you so much, Gail. I so enjoyed that portrait of the New York 1920s through that, understanding of the skyscraper, but also through the eyes of artists and the work of artists, painters, photographers, filmmakers. It's such a great reminder of the intertwined nature of cultural production. So I really appreciated that. So my question is, do you have a sense of whether the architects of the 1920s of these skyscrapers were in a kind of cross-pollinating exchange with artists in the time, and do you look at that at all?
That's really an excellent question, and I'm glad you asked it, because it certainly is something to think about. I really wonder about that. I do think that they themselves were a very strong community, as you can see at the Beaux-Arts ball. But the extent to which they really knew the artists who were engaged with these projects is important and interesting. One artist that I can point to who I think is key here is Lee Lowry at Rockefeller Center. So I had to kind of really cut this talk back. So I couldn't show any of Lee Lowry's sculptures. But Lowry was known for his work with Goodhue at the Nebraska State Capitol in the early 20s. And, also, just generally well known as a sculptor who worked with architects. So for certain, there was a sense of collaboration, a sense of give and take with Lee Lowry and the architects of Rockefeller Center, and the many artists who contributed to Rockefeller Center. He's not the only one. And so, it's just one could go on about the murals and about the other sculptures at Rockefeller Center. So I think if I were to answer that question in the way that it deserves to be answered, I would start with Rockefeller Center.
Great. Yeah, no, that stuck in my mind too as you were presenting Prometheus. Okay, so we have one question that I can read to you, Gail. So we have Elaine Stiles is asked, she says, thank you for such a compelling talk, ! One of the things that struck me is the integration of various arts embodied in the skyscraper. And the question is, what kind of conditions fostered this work? And do you see any similar conditions today?
Wow, another fascinating question. I had such great colleagues here at Roger Williams. I'm so fortunate. I really do wonder about this. I do think that New York in the 1920s, that the more I look at it, it's very clear that there is just this really great fertility of imagination in all of the arts that kind of comes together in a wonderful way. What encourages this? I mean, it's a very, very interesting thing to think about. I do think that if you look at O'Keeffe, that the skyscraper, and this is part of my thinking for this one chapter I'm working on, that for certain artists, the skyscraper inspired them to think in new ways. So if we go back to Stieglitz and we look at his Flatiron, or we look at Alvin Langdon Coburn and his wonderful views from the top of, say, the Singer Tower or earlier on, I think that sort of excitement about these new building forms and seeing them as modern inspired certain modern artists, modern photographers, and changed their way of seeing the world. And so my sense is, what interests me personally, and I think ties into Elaine's question, is that the architecture inspired a certain kind of art from these artists. And so in that sense, there is a sense of dynamic exchange. Now, whether the architects are, sitting around a coffee, sitting at a cafe, taking out a cigarette and talking to the artist, it's say, I'm imagining Paris, it's not quite that, I don't think. But nonetheless, it's a very exciting moment. And we also can't forget Stieglitz and his 291 gallery and his, Center for American Photography, this kind of thing. So certainly there were circles of artists who were keenly engaged with the skyscraper, but the extent to which they're really talking with the architects is such an interesting question, and one that I haven't noticed any of this in my research, I hope that helps. And with regard to today, I do think there are interesting collaborations going on out there. I'd love to hear more about them between artists and architects.
Great, thanks. Okay, another question here. This one's from Ann Proctor. She says, so helpful to think about all these overlaps. Your focus on materials was so interesting. For prefabricated components, what other kinds of products did those factories create? This is a different approach to the cross-pollination question, arts and industry here.
Thanks, Ann. That's another great question. I appreciate this so much. I really do need to point to the Empire State as an early example of this notion of making or producing the elements of the building in advance. I mean, it's very well orchestrated in that sense. And it's Sterrett Brothers and Aiken and the schedule and the economics involved with building as quickly as possible that I think made Sterrett Brothers really think about how one could in advance size and cut the limestone, the glass and so on. But that is a kind of prefabrication that at the time is very new. And what I have found interesting is that we see, look at Walter Gropius and the Bauhaus, for instance, and their ideas about standardization and rationalization. We see advances in that in Europe, and we see the influence of that, especially during World War II for war housing and so forth. But not so much during the 1920s. I think the Empire State is an exception in that sense. Much later, for example, the Lever House in the 50s, prefabrication really becomes the way that one builds a skyscraper, and the materials are glass and metals, and especially aluminum that are prefabricated, and that changes, of course, the appearance of the building. And so, I think among certain architects at that time, there's a sense of loss of the craft. I mean, between the Depression and World War II, there's just the apprentice systems dies. Even in the world of architecture, architectural firms close, and there's just not much construction. So there's this world of handcraft that gets lost, and that is lamented by many.
We've got some great questions coming in from your colleagues. I don't want
to I'm so fortunate.
Avoid those, but I do have one I'd like to address. I found it fast. First of all, there's so many things that I could talk about here because I teach, the photography of this period, and so much of what you talk about is relevant for that. But I was struck by how many times there were references to ancient architecture of one kind or another. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon is constant kind of reference, and whether it was that or an Egyptian entrance, or so this balance of modern and archaic and modern and ancient, I thought was something a little unexpected. And I'm wondering if is that sort of just a common motif that you could talk a little bit more about? Or
well, one thing I'd like to point out right offhand, because it's very interesting. I gave an early version of this talk last May, as I said, for this Paul Manship exhibition at the Wadsworth Atheneum Museum of Art. And the title of that exhibition was Paul Manship, Ancient Made Modern. And so they were keenly interested on his connections to antiquity as his springboard, and then how he as a sculptor, took that into a kind of, with Prometheus, a version of the human figure that still had that kind of scale of the figure, I think, that we see in the sculptures of ancient Greece, but brought that into the modern era with the way he handled the lines and the specifics of making the form. And I think, Randall, being an art historian, you're much more, what can I say, better positioned to speak to that than I am. With regard to the architecture, there is still a strong emphasis on classicism. You still see classical skyscrapers, but I think when we look for what's new, we turn to that exposition of decorative arts and everything around it, the Art Deco in Paris. And that exposition, I think, is interesting to look at because you do see the ancient there mixed with everything else. But what really caught on, I think, for these architects was this sense of texture. And this comes out of theater, even theater draperies, that sort of thing. They're fascinated with textures. And so if you're trying to create a textured elevation, with tiles and terracotta and brick, it's that in a sense, it's hard to find a model in antiquity for that. So to answer your question, those models were very much there, especially in the film imagery. But there's there's this desire to find these other exotic and whatever can be the grist for the mill, to make these textured surfaces. That's speaking just about architecture.
Thank you. Yeah.
Great. So I have a few more questions here. This one's from Edgar Adams. He's asking, to what do you attribute Hood's modernist turn? Was there a specific event or influence that led to that change? And he says the question relates particularly to the Daily News.
Edgar, such a great question. This is fascinating. I'm so glad I've done this because it's just advancing my thinking another step. I think with Hood, and Hood is such an interesting architect because it wasn't just the Daily News, it was the McGraw-Hill, for instance, where by the end of the 20s, he's doing these kind of remarkably interesting things. And the McGraw-Hill, for instance, is included in the International Style exhibition. So even the Hitchcock and Johnson in 1932, granting the imprimatur to certain buildings, choose the McGraw-Hill, which is a Hood building. I can only say that I really do believe, and I know that the art historian Wanda Korn goes into this quite extensively, about the exchange happening between New York City and Paris, for instance. Not that Hood traveled, but there's a lot of back and forth between Europe and New York, especially Berlin and Paris at this time. And I think he's, and also I think, he and others are simply looking around, but at what's being produced in Europe, certainly they know about the Bauhaus. And I think they're making a decision that they're going to take their architecture in a new direction. But as I'm talking through this, I'm also thinking of the PSFS building of 1932, and that is fully modern. And of course, there we have William Lescaz, coming from Switzerland, and so that explains that. But Hood, when he was designing the RCA building, he's already into the early 30s. So that's about the best answer I can give, because I can't say he's looking at any one particular source or talking to anybody in particular. He's just a remarkable architect. It's so sad he died so early on. It's unfortunate.
Great. So a couple more here, Gail. This one's from Steve White. He says, he's recalling he worked for an architect who talked about this period, particularly in America, as pre-Bauhaus modernism in architecture and the arts. And so he's wondering if that's a framing that you've thought about, or also a second addition to that question, was someone like Eliel Saarinen an influence as well, who had come to Cranbrook in the 1920s?
Yeah, Saarinen, and perhaps this should be given more emphasis because Saarinen's and Cranbrook are an important phenomenon on the American scene. And that Chicago Tribune Tower competition entry, that's really what brought Saarinen to the US and to New York. And then from there, he went to Detroit at the sponsorship of George Booth. He taught for a while at the University of Michigan. So he was out in the Midwest, later on in the 20s, but nonetheless, that Chicago Tribune entry is 1922, and Sullivan extolled it. He called it sublime, and architectural critics thought it was great. And Saarinen was given he was celebrated when he came to New York City. So certainly Raymond Hood knows about Saarinen. So to get back to Edgar's question, maybe we should take a closer look at Saarinen in all of this. Steve, mentioning kind of pre-Bauhaus, this is sort of interesting because the Bauhaus is such a different thing. But anybody would have said in the 1920s, this is the site of modernity. I mean, this is where the modern is really happening, is in New York City. There's no question. I don't think anybody would have said pre-Bauhaus. I think they would have said, this is it, this is the metropolis. It's the world modern metropolis. And European architects are making pilgrimages here. And of course, Corbusier finally makes it here in 1935.
Great, so there's one more here. So anonymous attendee, thanks you for your talk. It was fascinating. And says creativity is often defined by the constraints under which it happens, as much as potential extravagance. How central was the 1919 zoning law to the designs of skyscrapers that were built in the decade after?
Extraordinarily important. And I think that the person writing this, this question is right on the mark. I mean, I think that kind of constraint was inspiring to architects. But what I tried to point out early on, and I don't think has been emphasized enough, is that George Burdett Ford, he's kind of a quiet guy. He's much an architect as he was a planner in New York City. He was very interested in the city beautiful early on. He was a key advisor on the creation of the zoning resolution of 1916. He drew several diagrams. This is somebody who is thoroughly Beaux-Arts through and through, who really understands proportion. My sense about George Burdett Ford is that he was really designing the future city. So in other words, they look like kind of cold calculating restrictions, but they're very specific in the dimensions that they prescribe. And he had studied all of that with massing models and of all kinds. And so this is somebody, it's one of those people in history we don't hear much about. He deserves more credit. I think he really thought through the aesthetics, the aesthetic implications of this zoning law.
Well, great. So this has been a really great 15 minutes here of question and answer. And I really appreciate everyone's questions and wonderful to hear your responses to them, Gail. It was a really fantastic talk. And I think we'll close out here. Thanks also, Randall, for being a part of this. And everyone at home, have a great night. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you, everyone.